talk a bit about the way all these things have affected the church in a moment, keeping in mind the major cultural shifts that have taken place. Sometimes nothing happens in 3 years in society, and sometimes 3 years happens in 3 weeks. And so we're in one of those, what I call microwavable moments in history, in which things have happened very quickly in terms of transformation and change. And so at the heart of repair, this verse in Ephesians, lies a range of therapeutic remedies for the damage which has been caused. So there's what one might call preventative care, helping, and we realized how terrible you were at this because of some of the ways Christians behaved during the pandemic, and how many, sadly, have abandoned their faith. And globally, by the way, it looks like church attendance is either never going to recover its numbers, or it's going to take a very long time to get back to the numbers that there were pre-pandemic as people drift away. There are a range of reasons for this. People have lost their faith. They didn't think their faith seemed completely irrelevant in the face of a daily media onslaught that says we're following the science is going to save us, vaccines are the answer. You rarely heard that God was the answer, the church was the answer. And so in the face of that massive cultural onslaught, saying that what we're going to be saved from was by doing this, and then medical science, the church has appeared to many Christians as increasingly irrelevant, and so they've abandoned church life. And so we've got brokenness in that way. And then there are those who are still content because churches are still doing a hybrid service. They're doing in church, and then they're broadcasting it. More and more people are content to watch it at home. I did some coaching with very senior business leaders, and I've got a guy I've been working with for 4 or 5 years. I meet him 3 or 4 times a year in some expensive London restaurant, which he pays for. I said, so how are you? And he said, oh, no, I'm fine. And how's your faith? Oh, well, yeah, it's fine. And I said, have you been back to church yet? And church has been open for, a year. And he said, oh, no. No, he said, no. He said, I dip in and out on Zoom. And he said, I find it much easier just to come downstairs about 11. He said, I've got a glass of wine in my hand. He said, church is so much easier to tolerate with a glass of wine in my hand. And he said, I just put the glass of wine just out of shot in the screen here. And he said, and I just put a shirt on. He said, I just keep my pajama bottoms on, no one sees it. And he said, it's just much more chilled. And then he said, sometimes I just turn my camera off and wander around a bit if things are a bit boring, and come back and engage it. And I was trying to say to him, yes, but you've divorced yourself now from church in any meaningful way. But it's so much more convenient. And so we have to help people. And one of the ways may be that we have to turn off the live streaming. Now, that may not be the answer. But we have to find a way to stream into homes of people who genuinely can't get out, because that's a ministry to help them. But the trouble is, how do we make sure that people who could come do come? Because Christianity is a physical religion. There's bread, there's wine, there's water, there's touch, there's engagement. Christianity is a very earthy religion based on its Jewish roots, which are very earthy. We can't do it remotely. Jesus didn't send us a video. He came in person to the earth. We need that physicality to be the best that we can be as a church. We need not just to be on the Zoom, but in the room. We have to do that if we're going to be the Church of Jesus. And so I think part of the repair process is encouraging people back to engagement in terms of fellowship, because how are people repaired and blessed and helped? They're repaired and blessed and helped by the direct intervention of the Holy Spirit in their lives, mediated through Scripture and prayer, and just direct intervention of God in their lives if they're open to that. But equally, if I may say this, it's mediated through fellowship and through people. And it's other people often that keep us close. I've had lots of people in church life who say, Steve, for the last 2 years, I've just come to church to please my wife. And it's only in the last few months that I've actually reconnected again with faith in a dynamic way. But they kept coming. And that corporeity kept them through the difficult times. So there's repair, which is preventative medicine. You know, the things that doctors are always saying to us: 5 portions of fruit and vegetable a day, a bit of exercise, try and keep your weight in order, don't smoke, don't drink too much alcohol. Every year I have to go, my organization sends me for a full medical, and I mean a full medical. It just goes on for what appears to be ever. It's a whole morning, actually, of stuff. And I know the questions that they're going to ask me, and I sort of nod in the right direction. Well, Mr. Gaukroger, you could do with getting a bit more exercise. I go, yes, you're right. Yeah, that's right. Does that mean I'm going to do it? Probably not. So there's preventative care spiritually, and what the pandemic exposed was that people had been for too long consumers of a religious product rather than genuine disciples. In other words, they were spectators of a religious event on a Sunday morning without it touching the depths of their soul. So one of the things we're going to have to redo as churches is we're going to have to find a way to repair people by increasing the discipleship content of our ministry, or addressing the discipleship deficit. Because what's happened through the period of the 80s and into the start of the 21st century is that we largely in our churches created spectators who watch spiritual religious performances. And that's possible to do as a kind of taste exercise, but without ingesting and being changed by the content. And that's an enormously significant challenge that we're going to have to address in church life going forward. The increase in actual personal engagement with the truths of Scripture. Otherwise, Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher theologian, wrote about this movingly ages ago when he said, many people think of the Church of Jesus like going to the theatre, where the church congregation is the audience, and then there are actors on the stage performing, which we watch, and hidden somewhere behind the stage there's a prompter who, when they forget their lines, whispers what they should be doing. And Kierkegaard says that's a completely wrong view of the nature of the church, and that won't breed disciples, it will breed church attenders. What's actually happening in church is the audience is God, right? And the prompters are the people who lead worship and who preach, and the congregation is the audience, and that God is looking at us, and we at the front are simply prompting this congregation to grow, to worship, to pray, to learn, in order to be equipped to go out and to serve. And that we mustn't think ourselves with the passivity of watching something happen. And this thought occurred to me actually many years ago in Dallas. I was watching the Dallas Cowboys play, and they were a good team, by the way, then. And sorry, I'm being rude about Dallas Cowboys. I know I shouldn't do that. But it was the day, this shows how old I am, it was the days of Tom Landry and Roger Staubach and all that stuff. You old people like me, you'll remember all that. And it struck me then how like the church it was. Thousands of people in the stand who desperately needed exercise, watching a few who desperately needed rest. And it struck me the church is often like that, where a few people do all the stuff and lots of people watch them do it. That's why we have a discipleship deficit. And so going forward now, if we're to repair people's lives, we have to get them ready for the next pandemic or the next major challenge by making sure they're self-feeders, that they're not dependent on a weekly Sunday school class or a weekly sermon in order to be fed. That's good, of course, but that they're self-feeders so their spiritual depth is vastly increased, and then they're ready for whatever life throws at them. Because there are lots of what we would call fair weather Christians, and the pandemic has exposed this, where as soon as a problem hits, their faith seems to fall apart because they don't have any resilience. It's not built into their, souls. So we are going to need significant repair structures, which will mean increasing the discipleship diet in most of our churches, and not relying on a Sunday morning event so exclusively, but for a whole range of other ways of helping people engage the gospel at a much deeper, life-transforming way. And that does mean that as we face the dilemmas going forward, which is declining church congregations because they didn't come back, and congregations that are sitting there afraid, for all the reasons we spoke about in the first session, are going to need to be invested in quite different ways. Not pandering to those fears, but continuing to use Scripture to call people not to a secular view of the way you handle fear, which is, how do you handle fear? You handle it through counseling, and you handle it through pharmaceutical intervention, drugs of one kind or another. And by the way, in an acute state, that's perfectly appropriate for Christians. That's fine. But overall, we should be helping people deal with fear at the chronic, low-level, low-grade way through making them much more resilient in terms of biblical and scriptural values. What's been interesting in Ukraine, in the war situation, and we have very good evidence of this now, is that those churches which modeled performance, be it at the charismatic end or at the liturgical end, their folk have evaporated into the sand. But churches which emphasize genuine discipleship have had people staying and praying and caring. Some fabulous examples, just to encourage you, of churches running food delivery services, and they're going out and they're feeding Russian soldiers as they arrive, and they're running out of food, and they're abandoning their tanks and finding themselves with no food and no water, and they're being fed by Ukraine Christians. If that isn't an act of grace, I don't know what is. And they're gathering. Have you seen the stuff on YouTube about the Ukrainian underground church reading Psalm 31 together, sharing it? This is Psalm 31. Just for a moment, pause long enough to identify with your Ukrainian brothers and sisters right now. As they read this, they read it yesterday throughout some of those main cities. In you, O Lord, I have taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame. Deliver me in your righteousness. Turn your ear to me. Come quickly to my rescue. Be my rock of refuge, a strong fortress to save me. Since you are my rock and my fortress, for the sake of your name, lead me and guide me. Free me from the trap that is set for me. For you are my refuge. Into my hands I commit, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now imagine reading that with the bombs falling around you. How real that is. And so that's the depth that we're looking to recreate in churches going forward if we're to be involved in repair. But there's not only personal repair, which clearly needs those things to happen in our church life, increased in depth in our discipleship. There's community repair, because of lockdowns and controls is that local businesses have come under enormous pressure, particularly in the hospitality sector. Now, some of the big agencies will survive, they'll recapitalize, they'll be damaged, people will lose their jobs and so on, but they'll stay in business. So how can the church address the fact that more and more corner shops, as we might call them, local businesses run by a mom and a pop operation, a little cafe, a coffee shop, a small business, could not survive the lockdown processes? And so it seems to me the Church of Jesus is going to have to think of themselves not simply as looking after those who come, but looking after those who don't come. As Archbishop William Temple said over a century ago in the UK, the church is the only society that exists for the benefit of non-members. That's why we're around. And so the brokenness which COVID has caused, yes, mental health, there's an absolute explosion of mental health issues in society. There's going to be, as I said earlier, an explosion of untreated cancer conditions and heart conditions. Early on in the pandemic, 3 months in, I spoke to one of Britain's senior oral surgeons dealing with references from dentists about strange oral cancers in the mouth. And she said to me, Stephen, I've seen in the last 3 months 8% of my normal patient load. Do you know what that means? She said, either it means all cancers disappeared apart from those 8%, or we've got 92% of oral cancers that are getting worse by the day, and by the time they come to me, they'll be inoperable. She'd only seen 8%. So we have this tsunami of other health conditions that are about to burst upon the scene. However, governments try to ameliorate that by pouring extra resources into healthcare systems. And it means the poor are likely to suffer most about that, as they always do. So the chances are the church is going to have to be re-energized about repairing community brokenness. How can we look around and see the people in our towns, in our streets, our neighbors and friends who used to have a job and now don't have a job, as unemployment rises and as struggle comes? And of course there might be generous unemployment payments. Could be, there are in many countries. That doesn't give people dignity and a sense of worth and work. And it exacerbates mental health problems because it keeps them feeding their family, but they're sitting at home with nothing to do. I want to tell you this. My mental health is only good because I'm busy. I'm just being honest. If I was sitting at home all the time, every day, with nothing to do, I promise you I would be difficult to live with. My wife thinks it's true now. Sometimes she'll say to me, well, darling, take a morning off. Just take a morning off and come home. When we were first married, I used to, agree. And I would come home and I'd sit there and I'd say to her, now what? And she'd say, no, just be at home. Well, I'd only been there about 30 minutes and she sent me back to the office. But because I can't stand it. I have to do something. So now my wife knows, we've been married 40 years perfectly happily, that if she wants me to take time off and to do something, she invites me with her to do something. People who are without work, sometimes the mental health situation gets worse even if you solve the financial situation. How can the church provide meaningful work parties and schemes of employment? We've rarely got involved in that before. We thought that was the state's job. But what if as a Christian organization we could make employment schemes part of what we're about? Of thinking about not just giving the poor money, but the dignity of causality, that they could actually change something and make a difference in their lives. And so the church, in repairing the individual discipleship who come, can then look out and say, how in our community, with all the brokenness, with all the absence of work, with undiagnosed conditions, with anxiety levels at record levels, how can the church be this loving agent of God into those situations? And it will demand pastors of churches to think of themselves not simply as the pastor of the flock in front of them, but the pastor of the community, in the way that the old parish priest was in Western Europe 100 years ago, where the most educated man in most communities in Europe 100 years ago was the vicar or the priest or the pastor. And they looked to him because they didn't have the education ability to go somewhere else. Wouldn't it be thrilling if post-pandemic, post-lockdown, with the anxiety of a war in Europe and what that will mean, hovering over society, if all of a sudden people in need looked first to their local church for care and compassion, rather than looking first to a range of other agencies. And that's why we have to shout from the rooftops about the value of the gospel, and we have to model it. Because in the last 3 years, across Western societies, the media, amongst others, has squeezed the church to the edges of society, as we've said. If you keep on saying, stay away from people, don't go out, get the vaccine, wear a mask. I'm not knocking any of these things, by the way. But and we're following the science, and the science is going to rescue us, and the science will get a vaccine. And when the science does, we'll all be protected, and it will all be fine. Now we know that's not true, but do you see the messaging? Where's the church in that? Where's faith? Where's God in it all? And so for many people, the church has seemed utterly irrelevant in the last 3 years. Not for everyone. Churches have done some amazingly great things during lockdown. There's some brilliant examples of care in the community and feeding people and compassion. But I think we are going to have to recognize that this new world, this brave new world, to use Aldous Huxley's phrase from his book, this brave new world is a damaged world where everything's harder for most people, and the structure of society has been really hurt. And so our job in patching that up is not simply to be a kind of local social services, but a local expression of God's kingdom with glorious power and love, so that we repair society, not just by feeding the hungry, but by presenting the good news of Jesus. My son-in-law, a young man in his 30s, has started a group some time ago called the Grace Network. And in the last 5 years, has set up organizations which provide baby clothes for single mums, which takes ex-offenders and gives them new training, that recycles furniture for women who are victims of domestic violence and need rehoming, and 4 or 5 of these projects. He's 35, I guess, now, and in the past 5 years, he's now got to be the leader of an organization with 40 employees. And he employs them from all sorts of backgrounds that no one else would employ them. Ex-drug addicts, ex-offenders. They don't have to be a Christian to work there, but they pray each morning. The gospel is present in that situation. And it's a marvelous example of repairing society. Because it's not just a kind of do-gooder thing in which you just patch up a little bit of need, but every activity is given in the name of the Christ who fed the hungry, the Christ who raised the dead, the Christ who gives eternal life. And so there is no conflict between community repair and introducing people to the life of Christ as they're born again. Both those things are necessary. And so the pandemic and this new world forces us to repair locally individuals and to repair the community and to look outwards in fresh ways, in ways that we haven't done before. Perhaps I just pause there, because there's another really big theme around the role of the state and the way we engage with that, which probably I ought to pick up when we're all together after 11:30. So just reflecting back on all I've said about personal damage, and then about the church and its needs to repair those inside, and then send repaired people out in different ways, the church will need to be restructured around those agenda items. Because historically what the church has done is had a series of activities within the life of the church which at their best are equipping, but at their worst take up all people's time. And so they have no opportunity to be this salt and light thing, this repairer of community, because they have no time, because they're in a small group or a deacon group or a ministry group or something. And they've also got to try and raise a family and put bread on the table and do those things. And because we haven't understood this, what we've done, the church has been hollowed out from the inside out, and it's meant that not only are less people coming to church in the West, which is tragic enough, but it means that the active participants in a church are people 55 and older, and that the young marrieds are too busy earning a living to do much outside, and if we're tying them up in a few meetings, that's all they've got time for. And so we have a workforce which is increasingly aging in the life of the church. And so in Western Europe, I don't know what the numbers are here in America, the church is both served by and funded by the over 55s. And the under 55s, however affluent and gifted, may generously give in some cases, but broadly speaking, they don't have the culture of sacrificial giving that an older generation had. Now that's a dangerous paradigm to continue, because it means those of us who are over 55 are going to bless the church one more time through a legacy when we die, but not before then. What will happen to equipping and releasing a new generation? So we're going to have to think about what the church structure looks like and how we can be cured of meeting-itis, which is a kind of disease in which the answer to every problem is another meeting. One of the things that Zoom's really helped with, by the way, and I don't want to be negative about it because really helped, is that, I don't know if you've tried to do business meetings on Zoom, but if you're wise, they're much quicker than business meetings live. Because the chit-chat beforehand and the cups of coffee and whatever, you can have coffee in a Zoom meeting, but you've got to make it yourself. It's a bit of a pain. And so Zoom and online meetings tend to be quicker because you lose interest just staring at a screen rather more quickly than you might do if you've got out of the house and driven somewhere and in a meeting and so on. So we've saved ourselves lots of time. So I hope we'll keep Zooming in some meetings. I hope we'll keep managing the blessings of the internet to the advantage of the administration of the church, because I think it's going to help us enormously. But I hope that we'll abandon some of our meetings in order to free people, fully discipled, to be agents of goodness in society as a whole, in the community. Okay, let me pause there just for a few minutes and then take some questions, and then 11:30-ish we'll come back to another topic. I can. And that is a really, really important question. The training of leaders for the future is vital for this thing to work. So theological education has historically consisted of Old Testament, New Testament, theology and church history. Broadly, those are the four academic disciplines that have undergirded most theological education. And then over the last 50 years, colleges have added in evangelism or pastoral care or some of the other practicalities. And I think that colleges are going to have to reconfigure the way they do training for leadership by making an understanding of the culture and missionary activity a feature of all those disciplines. So instead of having mission as topic number 7, which might well be right, is thinking, how can all we do in kingdom terms be seen in all those disciplines? How can we understand the Old Testament in terms of the growth and expansion of the people of God? How can we understand and preach the New Testament in those terms? How can we learn the lessons of church history in terms of what we know of revival or evangelistic enterprises in terms of today? So I think we've got to completely view the lens of all our academic work, and that's important, the academic work, through the lens of what's the way to connect with contemporary culture and to see it changed. And we've got to change the pastoral paradigm, I believe, in the way we recruit to our theological seminaries. So many colleges around the world that train ministers, vicars, pastors, whatever, have a pastoral paradigm. They're basically saying, we're training pastors. Come and we want to teach you how to preach to a congregation and teach you how to care for people and so on. That's an important role. But if that's your main paradigm, then you're really all about institutional maintenance. Whereas we've got to train people to think in terms of the fivefold ministry in Ephesians. How do we train apostles? Prophets? We know a bit more about evangelists and teachers and pastors. By that I mean the roles that are significant and visionary and dynamic and growing, entrepreneurial, you might say. And we haven't been very good in theological education at developing those things. Some colleges are doing very exciting experiments in that area, and others are still lagging behind and really still focusing on these simple academic disciplines, which are very important, but they're a foundation, they're not the goal. And it seems to me that one of the advantages in some of the developing worlds where I've worked, so where I've taught in India or in Nepal, some African colleges, in the interview process, they ask 2 questions to the candidate, which I've rarely heard asked of theological folk here. They ask these 2 questions. Firstly, how many people have you led to Christ this year? That's a question they ask them. And then secondly, and I'm thinking of a situation in India, they say, how many churches have you planted? And they sometimes they say, well, I've come to theological college to learn how to do it. And they'll say, well, when you've planted 2 or 3 churches, come back. Because the emphasis is on action, change, growth, life. Not simply training in some discipline to care for the flock. So I think we're going to have to rethink the way we look at theological education and make sure that people who come are equipped as mission agency. Now, their gifts may be different. I'm not an evangelist. That's not what we're talking about. I'm not trying to turn everybody into Billy Graham. God rest his soul. Thank God for him and for his amazing work. But we're not trying to make everybody that. We're trying to make everybody, pastoral gifts, teaching gifts, and so on, focused on this wider kingdom societal goal that sees society so broken that the love of Christ, God really did so love the world that he wanted to see it restored. That, we need women and men with that vision. And then secondly, we need to attract a better caliber of people into Christian leadership. Generally speaking, we've attracted fairly, and if you're a pastor, please don't take this personally. Apart from the people in this room who are clearly the cream of the crop, apart from you guys, obviously, overall in the last 40 years, we have attracted a relatively mediocre group of people to pastoral ministry. And you see that everywhere, because you talk to young people in the churches often. I've done this in France recently. I was in Switzerland doing it. You talk to them, what do you want to do for God? I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be a doctor. I'd like to be a politician. They're passionate about faith. There's no question about that. But the way they see a great opportunity for a first-rate mind and a gifted, passionate individual is certainly not to be a minister. I said to one young man not that long ago, why don't you want to be a pastor of a church? He said, oh, gosh, just so boring. You have to all these preaching and these meetings. You have to go to meeting after meeting and all this discussion, and it goes nowhere. Nothing ever happens very quickly. He said, I want to actually change something. Someone actually said to me, if I wanted to be the curator of a museum, I'd do that. Now, you might think that's very cynical about pastoral ministry. But if that's the image in people's minds, no wonder we're not recruiting the very best people to senior leadership ministry. And you can see that, by the way, if you can track that from, I would say, the 1970s in theological education around the Western world, where, of course, there are incredible examples of the opposite of that, where very gifted people used by God in those settings. But we have to change the model of this so that people don't think they're coming into ministry simply to look after some sheep, wonderful and important though that is, but also to see the needs of the wider community. And we've got to set the scene to young men and women today, which says serving Jesus in this way is a wonderful, high, high, high calling. Sense that. Look at the Apostle Paul. Look at some of the great statesmen of the world. I was really thrilled, excited by this. A few years ago when Billy Graham passed away, I was invited to go to Billy Graham's funeral to represent British Christians at Billy Graham's funeral. And it was great, 2,200 of us in a tent in Charlotte, 500 from 500 from overseas, 1,800, 1,700, 1,800 from the US, and to hear stories of the unbelievable impact of that man. And I was praying there because there were not many young people in the room, as you might imagine. Generally, people who go to funerals are the people who will be going to next. So it's not a youthful crowd. But it was beamed around the world. And I was praying, as the service went on, I was praying, Lord, just the sheer global inspiration of this. Not another Billy Graham, that's not what you want. But please will you raise up women and men of that stature who can shape society in whatever way you have in mind. What an example. And to call people to that. And I think in theological training we're going to need a change around the content and a change around the paradigm of what we're looking to send out the other end, and a change of aspiration so that people see it as a wonderfully worthwhile thing to get involved in. I'm so sorry, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that. with the sound of Christianity. Oh, the science and Christianity. Ah, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, my English ear's not always attuned to the... I was in a restaurant in Fort Worth when I was here some months ago. Back last year, end of last year. Doing some, I think I had a meeting at Southwestern's over in Fort Worth, isn't it, over there? And I went into quite a nice restaurant and sitting with some friends. I am answering the question, I promise. And they said, do you want something to drink? And I said, I'd like water, please. And the waitress clearly didn't understand what I'd said. And she said, what? And I said, water, please. And she just looked confused and she said, I don't think we have that. And I said, no. And then a colleague of mine said, he means water. Huh. And clearly her ear was not attuned to this British accent. Because when I heard that this restaurant didn't have water, I was very surprised. I didn't think it was the most amazing thing anybody had ever asked for in a restaurant. So I apologize if my ears aren't quite attuned to these words. Science and faith, how can they coexist? When I wrote my first book on apologetics some years ago, one of the driving energies of that was the questions related in what was then a modern society about the challenges that faith faced. And one of them was, aren't science and faith just implacable enemies? Aren't they just, they'll never coincide. And I think we can say philosophically that's not true, and we must argue that as strongly as we can from a philosophical point of view, from a practical point of view, as hard as we can. And because, well, there are a number of reasons. Firstly, modern science emerged from a commitment to try and understand God's world. It was Boyle, Faraday, Newton, lots of these guys were Christians, trying to work out how the world is. How does it work? How does God's laws of science work out? So some of the originators of contemporary science were indeed Christians. Now, that's true that there are lots of atheistic scientists today, but science in itself and its foundation is not anti-Christian. It's just that sometimes science is used to come to conclusions which Christians find difficult. So, for example, in the world of evolution and creation, scientists have made perfectly reasonable points about the way life seems to have arrived on planet Earth, and then they make an unreasonable jump from that perfectly reasonable scientific assessment to say, well, if all that's true, you don't need God in any of that, so there isn't a God. Well, it's an utterly illogical, unreasonable, and unwarranted leap from this bit of science. So what we've got to say about science, and I would use Stephen Jay Gould's phrase on this, a scientist, where he said science and religion are overlapping magisteria. And what he meant by that was that in hand, in partnership, that they provide enormous insight into the way the world works, but they're not enemies. They don't come like this against each other. And we can be helpfully saying that. They used to say, well, science and faith have always disagreed, and there have been great historical cases where the Scopes trial in the US, for example, where there's great supposed dismissal of faith and did we come from monkeys or not, and so on. But actually, if you read carefully the history of science and religion, I've got a good friend who did his Cambridge doctorate on this particular study. What you find is if you dig behind these conflicts, that they're a conflict between a scientific view and a faith view, but actually science doesn't say one thing or the other about all these things. Science can describe the oxygen we're breathing in this room, the fact that we're breathing in O2 and out CO2, amongst other things. Science can describe gravity and the fact that we're held to the floor rather than floating to the ceiling. Science can describe the way my vocal cords produce sounds, but science can't describe the effect that all that has in the depths of a human's life and the motivation. It can't answer certain questions. It can only answer others. And so what we've got to say about science is we're not iconoclastic about science. By that I mean we don't always say, well, that's just science. You know, they don't understand, they're just wicked scientists. No, we don't say that. On the other hand, we don't just accept every scientific viewpoint as if it's the only viewpoint. COVID's been a classic example of this. It started off by people saying we're following the science and then did nothing of the kind. And so we don't, just because someone says they're following the science doesn't mean they are. And so I think we've got a great opportunity to honor scientists who are genuinely trying to do good work, science and its daughter, technology. I think that we thank God for it. We praise God for the number of people who haven't died in the last 100 years because of scientific advances worked out in medical therapeutic interventions. But on the other hand, you can't put love in a test tube. You can't put hope under a microscope. And so what we've got to do, we've got to affirm the values which science cannot and should not address, because it's not the purview of science. So Christians shouldn't be rubbishing science and dismissing it, scientific views sometimes, but we should be affirming that the world is more than science. So Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, makes the big mistake of saying we are nothing but a collection of atoms. And so any nothing buttery argument is always wrong. We are a bunch of atoms, but we are more than that. And the only explanation of the universe is in a range of disciplines. And a scientific explanation on its own is just as empty and vacuous as any other explanation without the explanation of faith. So we can live with science, and we should affirm it and thank God for its good results. But we shouldn't be dictated to by scientists who speak outside their area of discipline and claim to tell us what to believe. They're no more authorities on that area than anybody else.